In this video, we will cover how authentication policies and policy objects function in AuthPoint and how they control user authentication. We will suggest some best practices for configuring and managing your authentication policies, and we will walk through a few common scenarios to show how they can be handled. Let's get started. When you add users to your AuthPoint account, they are assigned to groups. Users can be members of a single group or multiple groups at once. These groups can be AuthPoint groups you have created or groups synced from an external source, such as Active Directory. Authentication policies enable you to define how your groups of users authenticate to your AuthPoint resources. When a user attempts to authenticate, AuthPoint takes a look at their groups and the resource they are trying to reach. The authentication policy that matches these variables will define whether the authentication is allowed and if multi-factor authentication, or MFA, is applied. Authentication policies are processed just like a list of firewall policies. They are listed in the order of priority. AuthPoint uses the first policy in the list that matches all of the conditions of the authentication. If, in this example, a user is authenticating to the Logon app, then policy number 5 will be used, and MFA will be required. If no policies match the conditions of the authentication, then AuthPoint denies the authentication. When you create new authentication policies, it is important that you consider the order of your policies to ensure that users are only allowed to access the correct resources. Over time, your list of policies will grow and become more complex. We have the following recommendations to help. First, when you are managing or making changes to your policies, we recommend that you use filters to narrow down the list so that you can focus on the policies that are relevant. Second, create catch-all policies to define the authentication requirements for the majority of users that access specific resources. You might want to use broad conditions in these policies like all resources or all groups. Third, consider the exceptions in your environment and create policies to handle those exceptions. This might include allowing specific groups to authenticate with only a password, denying access to specific groups, or using network locations to define different access requirements based on where the authentication is coming from. MFA should be used whenever possible, but there are usually some situations where it just doesn't make sense. Finally, anytime you create new policies, they are placed at the bottom of your policy list. Always double-check the policy order and make sure that everything will be processed as expected. If policies are not ordered correctly, then exceptions may not be applied and users could be locked out. As part of authentication policies, you can create and apply policy objects. With policy objects, you can add additional conditions into your authentication policies so you can create more granular access requirements. AuthPoint always identifies the source IP address of any authentication, and with the network locations policy object, you can create authentication policies that only apply when users are authenticating from specific networks. At the time of this recording, AuthPoint only offers the network locations policy object, but additional types will be added in the future. How does this work for all of the different types of resources in AuthPoint? Well, any resource that functions over the internet, such as SAML or RDWeb, will always look at the source public IP address to determine when the network location applies. When users authenticate to the Logon app, which network location is used will depend on how the users are connecting to the computer. Network locations do not apply to authentications made over Radius to build a VPN connection, but you can apply network locations to authentications made through the VPN once it is connected. Let's take a closer look at the Logon app. There are three different ways that users can potentially access a computer with the Logon app installed, and which network location you use will vary based on the method. When the user is physically at the computer, this is a local logon. AuthPoint will identify local logons based on the public IP address of the network the computer is on. If there is more than one public IP address for the network, make sure you add them all. If the user is connecting to the computer using RDP, AuthPoint will identify the authentication based on the private IP address of the computer that is initiating the RDP connection. This applies whether the RDP connection is coming from the local network, over the internet, or through a VPN. When connected to a VPN, the source IP address will be assigned from a virtual subnet by the firewall, and AuthPoint will use this IP instead of the IP address of the remote computer. The last method are connections made through an RD Gateway server, which is part of remote desktop services. The RD Gateway acts as a proxy for the users, creating RDP connections inside the network. So add the RD Gateway server's private IP address to your network locations for AuthPoint to identify logons made through the RD Gateway. As part of this video, I will start from scratch and create authentication policies for a hypothetical environment. Most of my users will use MFA, but there are 4 exceptions in my environment I need to account for. I want all of my users to be able to access the IDP portal and Dropbox using just passwords, but other SAML resources require MFA. Users in the web-only group are only allowed to access the IDP portal and SAML resources. They do not have access to the VPN or resources at the headquarters. Users in the secure group only use hardware tokens. They need to be able to connect to the VPN using one-time passwords, and I only want them to see the OTP option when they authenticate to other resources for convenience. Users who are at the headquarters can authenticate to any resource without MFA. This includes users who are connected to the VPN. These are just a sample of exceptions that could come up in your environment. Many exceptions mean disabling MFA in some situations, which can decrease the overall security of the environment. However, exceptions can also make the experience easier and more convenient for your users. How you balance these options depends on your needs and security policies. This is something you will need to consider as you create authentication policies of your own. Here we are on the Watchguard Cloud dashboard. I will start by clicking Configure at the top, then AuthPoint, and I will review what is on the account. On the Resources page, you can see that I have configured a number of resources to protect them with MFA. On the Groups page, I have already synced several LDAP groups with AuthPoint and imported LDAP users. The users have been added to the groups in Active Directory, and I will use these LDAP groups to define how the users access the resources. For more information about syncing external users and groups, refer to the Integrate AuthPoint with LDAP or Azure AD videos. On the Policy Objects page, I have created a network location for my company's headquarters. I will need to use this network location when I allow users at the headquarters to authenticate without MFA. The headquarters network location is configured with the public IP address of the network, as well as a private 192 network range. The 192.168.114.0/24 network range is the default virtual subnet for the Watchguard IPv2 mobile VPN. When users connected to the VPN RDP to a computer at the headquarters, the Logon app will see the connection coming from this subnet. Any users physically at the headquarters will match against the public IP address when they authenticate to the Logon app and any other resource. Since my VPN is a full tunnel, any users connected to the VPN will also use this public IP address when they authenticate to SAML and other internet resources. Now I will check out the Authentications Policies page to start creating policies for my account. In this account, I will start from scratch by clicking Add Policy and creating a new catch-all policy. In my environment, I want most of my users to have access to all of my resources, with a couple exceptions. I will create a single catch-all policy that enforces MFA and apply this to all groups and all resources. Creating this policy means that all of my users can access any of the resources I have configured, as long as they can authenticate with MFA and there are no other policies above that deny them. A broad policy like this can work well to keep things simple for smaller environments, but if you have a large environment with many different types of access requirements, we recommend creating multiple catch-all policies for more granular control based on specific groups and resources. Now I can start to create additional policies that will handle my exceptions. The first exception is all of my users are able to access the IDP portal and Dropbox with just passwords. This policy only requires a password and is applied to all groups in the IDP portal and Dropbox SAML resource. The second exception is that users in the web-only group are only allowed to access the IDP portal and SAML resources. I will need to create two policies to handle this. The first policy will require MFA and apply to the web-only group, IDP portal, and all of my SAML resources. The second policy will deny authentications, and this policy will apply to the web-only group and to all resources. This policy is necessary to prevent those users from hitting my catch-all policy. The third exception is users in the secure group use hardware tokens and must be able to use OTP to connect to the VPN. I also want them to only see OTP as the option for other resources for convenience. When creating policies for Radius clients, there are two things you need to know. Radius Authentication does not use the QR code option for MFA, even if it is enabled in the policy. And if push is enabled, it will take priority over OTP, which means users must use push for MFA when authenticating to the VPN. In order to use OTPs, push must be disabled. I will create a policy that only allows OTP and applies to the secure group. For the resources, I will select all resources. The last exception involves my network location. I want to allow any users at the headquarters, as well as any users connected to the VPN, to be able to authenticate to resources with just their password. To do this, I will create a policy that only requires password authentication and apply it to all groups and all resources. Then I will add the headquarters network location, so this policy only matches when the authentication is coming from the headquarters. Users that authenticate from other locations will still use the catch-all policy and require MFA. When I created my policies, each new policy was added to the end of the policy list. I need to fix the order of my policies, or the policies will not be enforced as I expect. I will start by moving the catch-all policy to the bottom of the list so that all of my exceptions will take effect first. I will keep the policy for the IDP portal and Dropbox at the top, so any authentications to those resources will only need passwords. Below this, I will leave the two web-only policies, first the allow policy and then the deny. With this order, users in the web-only group can log into the IDP portal and access Dropbox with just a password. They can also access other SAML resources with MFA, but authentications to other resources like the VPN and Logon App are denied. Next, I will place the policy with the network location. This policy must be placed above the catch-all policy, so it takes effect when users authenticate from that location. Finally, I will leave the policy for the secure group right above the catch-all policy, so these users can still take advantage of the policies above, but will use this policy as their catch-all instead of the main catch-all policy. With my authentication policies in the correct order, I can start to test the authentications and make sure everything is working as expected. We can use the audit logs to help us troubleshoot policy issues. When we open the details for any user authentication, the policy used line will tell us which authentication policy was used. If this is not the expected policy, then you will need to review your policy list and fix any policy order or configuration issues. If you are trying to determine which IP address you need to add as a network location for the Logon app, we recommend authenticating from the location using a push. When you receive the push request on your phone, the details in the request will include the IP address that AuthPoint is seeing. That will do it for using AuthPoint authentication policies. In this video, we covered how authentication policies and policy objects are used to control how users authenticate to resources in AuthPoint. We also looked at a few different sample exceptions and configured authentication policies to handle them. When creating and managing your policies, we recommend filtering the list, creating catch-all policies to handle most of the users, creating policies for exceptions as needed, and then verifying the policy order.